Welcome back to The Ladder. Recently, we heard from ASIC Commissioner John Price about the importance of reinforcing culture in a climate of low trust. I spoke earlier with Joydeep Hall, a managing principal at People and Culture Strategies, about his stance on how culture and trust affect long-term performance.
I think corporate culture is obviously something that's attracted a lot of attention, a lot of publicity, particularly in light of things that have been discussed and traversed in the Royal Commission context. I think there is a need to focus on corporate culture, but the way in which that focus happens, I think, is just as important as the focus itself. The concern I see in working with organisations around culture on a daily basis is that at the moment it seems that every single issue that is arising within an organisation is being labelled or attributed as some kind of cultural problem or symptomatic of some poor culture. Now, it may well be the case that there is a broader cultural issue in organisations, whether that's in relation to how people are treated or in relation to compliance practices or other things that are part of their infrastructure. But not necessarily all things that go wrong reflect a poor culture. Sometimes they are isolated to individuals, sometimes they are isolated to departments. So there is a danger that corporate culture becomes the easy scapegoat or the easy catch-all for things that would ordinarily just be things that happen.
Joydeep, perhaps we can talk a little bit more about the actual definition of good corporate culture, and perhaps you can go even further and provide us some examples of good corporate culture versus poor corporate culture.
Well, I think there's no single definition of what good corporate culture is. Ultimately, an organisation is entitled to set its own vision and have its own values. When we're doing work with organisations around auditing their culture, for example, we start with looking at what their vision and values are and how well they articulate that vision and how well their values are consistent with that vision. And everything really flows from that. So when I talk about a good culture within an organisation, when we're working with organisations around building a good culture, we start with that vision and values piece. And then what we look at is what are the systems and structures that exist within that organisation to give effect to that particular vision and those values. And the final piece is very much the people piece, which is around capability and credibility. Do you have the right people to give effect and do justice to what your vision and values are, and are they credible? So it's more assessing what an organisation stands for in terms of its vision and values, rather than a single definition of what is a good corporate culture, because the reality is organisations across industry, across size, are all going to have a different look and feel in terms of what makes their culture good or otherwise.
Joydeep, it seems like we are living and working in a world where we're dealing with a lot of outside noise, be it the Banking Royal Commission, where we seem to be losing trust perhaps in our major banks, or whether it be governments adopting protectionist policies outside of sort of traditional politics, where perhaps we're losing trust in our politicians. Just pulling out a few examples. In light of all of this going on and this noise, is it even more important in this kind of world that we build trust and build good culture in our businesses?
I think that organisations absolutely need to be aware of greater scrutiny. Sometimes that greater scrutiny or closer scrutiny will be in the best interest of the organisation. It will allow them to look into things and fix problems that exist. There is also a danger, however, with that scrutiny, that organisations can be seen to be overreacting, or in fact do overreact to certain things at the merest sense that there might be a problem. And what we're seeing is that organisations are often not doing the things that are the right things to be doing from a people point of view when it comes to natural justice, making necessary inquiries, giving people the right to respond to allegations, insinuations, things like that. The fear that organisations have that their brand might be tarnished or damaged is often seeing them at the moment reacting in a very knee-jerk and extreme way without following natural processes. So yes, absolutely there is the need for greater diligence around these kinds of matters, but a caution not to overreact.
Is it fair to say, Joydeep, that our society has come to expect much more from companies than just those short-term shareholder returns?
I think it is fair to say that. I think that we live in an era where information is available and information is exchanged far more readily than would have been the case 15, 20 years ago. If someone is dissatisfied by a single experience, whether that's as a customer, as a shareholder, as an employee, these are matters that are no longer just going to be kept quiet or dealt with between that individual and the organisation or institution. These are matters that are probably going to have a far wider audience, and that's going to have an impact on brand and potentially profits in the long run as well.
Speaking about profits in the long run, what does good culture do to the longer term prosperity of businesses overall?
Well, I think so long as it's genuine and sustainable inquiries made into getting culture right and being clear about what good culture looks like within an organisation, that ultimately that will lead to a greater number of champions, both internally and externally, for a particular organisation. By internal champions, I'm of course talking about not just leadership but also employees. If you have a happy workforce who believe genuinely in the values of the organisation, believe that the culture that is created within that organisation is consistent with those values, they will be spruiking good news stories about that particular organisation. And from an external champion point of view, customers, those other stakeholders who interact with your organisation will also be making a positive contribution if they sense that you have held true to what you say you're going to do as an organisation. And the keeping of promises made is becoming increasingly important.
Joydeep, from what you're saying and from what we heard from the ASIC Commissioner John Price recently, it seems like culture and trust almost go hand in hand. What would you say is the best way for businesses to build corporate trust and therefore corporate culture?
I think it's a reflection of the need to keep promises, and it's one thing if an organisation makes no promises and engages in certain conduct. I think that what we've seen though is where organisations have invested a lot through their marketing and their branding and their advertising to hold themselves out as having a number of principles and values and make these commitment statements, but the experience of some, and it may not even be many, is that they have not held true to those promises and those commitments in their day-to-day operations. And it's that hypocrisy or that sense that these values, these commitments are really just made for the purposes of lip service, but very disconnected from reality, that's going to be a surefire way to lose trust or compromise trust between an organisation and a stakeholder.
Joydeep, Paul, I think we'll leave it there, but it's been a pleasure. We really appreciate you joining us on the program today. Thank you so much.
No problems. Thanks for having me.
That's all we've got time for.